The service elevator ascending the spine of the obsidian spire that was the Croft Tower did not hum. It swallowed sound. It was an aerodynamically sealed capsule of brushed steel, climbing at a rate of 30 feet per second, pressing the breath flat against Elias Vance's ribs. Outside the windowless shaft, a brutal Manhattan thunderstorm was lashing the glass facade of the 78th floor, but inside the carriage, there was only the faint, sterile scent of ozone and aerosol brass polish. Elias adjusted the collar of his tuxedo shirt, allowing his jaw to relax into a mask of practiced vacuity. To infiltrate the highest echelon of the global elite, one did not need a grappling hook or a halo drop. One only needed a perfectly tailored waistcoat, a tray of Dom Perignon, and the profound psychological camouflage of subservience. To the architects of the modern world, a man carrying a silver tray was not a man at all. He was an appliance. A ghost in a bow tie. He was the invisible man. The elevator slowed, the sudden deceleration tugging at his stomach. Elias took the final precious seconds of solitude to inspect his left wrist. Beneath the immaculate, fiercely starched white cotton of his French cuff lay a marvel of illicit engineering. It was a dermal mesh hacking array, bound to his forearm like a second skin, constructed from matte black polycarbonate and laced with microscopic graphene pathways. The band was currently dormant, drawing its ambient power from the thermoelectric heat of Elias's own radial artery. To a metal detector, it read as a titanium bone pin. To a biological scanner, it registered as scar tissue. But when activated, it was a skeleton key capable of unraveling the most sophisticated cryptographic firewalls on the eastern seaboard. Elias flexed his fingers. The band responded with a subvocal microhaptic pulse, thump-thump, assuring him the localized spoofing subroutines were primed. He shot his cuff, ensuring the stiff white fabric entirely swallowed the dark band, and picked up his polished silver tray. The elevator doors parted with a soft pneumatic hiss. Elias stepped out and immediately hit the wall. Not a physical wall, but a gauntlet of paranoia. The service corridor leading to the penthouse was bathed in the harsh, clinical glare of ultraviolet halogens. The walls were lined with architectural copper mesh, military-grade Faraday cages designed to choke out any unauthorized radio frequencies. At the end of the hall stood the checkpoint. Two men in charcoal suits flanked a reinforced blast door disguised as a mahogany entryway. But it was the third man who made the ambient temperature in the corridor drop. Marcus Thorne, head of Croft's private security apparatus. Thorne was a monolith of a man, carved from pale granite and old violence. His tailored suit did little to hide the predatory slop of his shoulders, and the coiled wire of his earpiece disappeared into short-cropped iron-gray hair. Thorne didn't look at the world. He interrogated it. His pale eyes scanned the 6 catering staff members who had just exited the elevator, his gaze stripping them down to their component parts. Elias kept his chin tucked, his eyes cast downward at a deferential 45-degree angle. He joined the queue, falling into line behind a terrified-looking sommelier. "Step up," Thorne's voice grated, sounding like crushed glass under a boot. Eyes wide, present wrists. The security measures were staggering. Elias watched as the sommelier stepped onto a pressure-sensitive mat that calculated his exact body weight against his biometric file. A multispectral camera mounted in the ceiling flashed, mapping the capillary beds in the man's retinas. "Clear," a mechanized voice chirped. It was Elias's turn. He stepped onto the mat. He forced his breathing to slow, utilizing a measured, 4-count tactical respiration technique to keep his heart rate at a boring, resting 65 beats per minute. He offered his wrists, palms up, to the security technician beside Thorne. The man passed a dense, heavy wand over Elias's arms. The wand swept over the left cuff. The starched white fabric remained pristine. Beneath it, the hacking band sat flush against Elias's skin, radiating nothing. The wand beeped a flat, affirmative green. "Look at the lens," Thorne commanded. Elias lifted his head. He allowed his eyes to widen slightly, feeding the multispectral camera a clear view of his retinas. He kept his expression dull, anxious, exactly like a gig economy waiter terrified of losing his night's wages. Thorne stepped closer. He smelled of peppermint and gun oil. The security chief leaned in, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Elias. For a second that stretched into eternity, Thorne's pale eyes locked onto Elias's dark ones. Elias gave him nothing to grip onto, no defiance, no intelligence, no spark. Just the hollow obedience of the invisible class. Clear, the machine announced. Thorne sneered slightly, losing interest. Go. Don't speak unless spoken to. If I catch you looking at the guests, I'll throw you off the balcony myself. Yes, sir, Elias murmured, his voice a perfect pitch of submissive whisper. He moved past the checkpoint, pushing through the heavy mahogany doors, and was instantly swallowed by the sensory explosion of the gala. The Croft penthouse was less a residence and more a monument to untouchable wealth. The ceiling vaulted 3 stories high, draped in a chandelier made of thousands of suspended Swarovski crystals that looked like frozen rain. The exterior walls were entirely composed of armored, soundproof glass, offering a dizzying, omniscient view of a rain-slicked Manhattan. The city below was a sprawling circuit board of amber and gold, bleeding into the black velvet of the night. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of white truffles, rare orchids, and the intoxicating musk of bespoke perfumes. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner, their notes floating above the low, predatory murmur of the world's most powerful people. There were tech billionaires in velvet dinner jackets, senators clutching crystal tumblers of scotch, and European heiresses dripping in conflict diamonds. Elias began his patrol. He moved with liquid grace, slipping between the clustered guests, offering flutes of champagne with a slight, deferential bow. With every step, his eyes darted, cataloging the room's architecture. Multi-directional thermal cameras were hidden in the ornate crown molding. The Wi-Fi network was completely localized and air-gapped from the outside world. To breach Croft's servers, Elias had to physically bridge the gap. He needed to get within 3 feet of the primary access terminal, and the primary access terminal was currently strapped to the wrist of the host. Elias spotted him near the center of the room, holding court by a sprawling indoor fire pit. Julian Croft. The billionaire tech magnate looked exactly as he did on the cover of Forbes, though the physical presence of the man carried a radioactive charisma that cameras couldn't capture. Croft was tall, possessing a lean Lupin elegance. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo with silk lapels that caught the firelight, and his dark hair was swept back from a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way. He was laughing at a joke made by a sweating tech minister, but Croft's eyes weren't smiling. They were calculating, constantly assessing the leverage he held over every soul in the room. On Croft's left wrist, partially concealed by his own cuff, was the Genesis watch. It was a bespoke piece of hardware, the master key to Croft's entire empire, housing the encrypted ledgers that Elias had been hired to steal. Elias adjusted his path. He needed to get close. He approached a group of hedge fund managers standing at the periphery of Croft's orbit. As he extended his tray to collect an empty glass, Elias subtly flexed his left wrist. Beneath the starched white cotton, the hacking band woke up. A searing localized heat bloomed against Elias's forearm as the graphene processors kicked into overdrive. A faint, icy blue luminescence bled into the fabric of his sleeve, invisible in the dim, moody lighting of the gala, but glowing brightly in Elias's mind. The band sent a rapid series of haptic vibrations, tap-tap-buzz, signaling that it had successfully intercepted the ambient Bluetooth handshakes in the immediate vicinity. Elias moved closer, stepping into the edge of Croft's inner circle. 3 yards. 2 yards. Thorne was suddenly there, appearing from the crowd like a shark breaching dark water. The security chief took up a position directly behind Croft, his eyes sweeping the perimeter. Thorne's gaze snagged on Elias. Elias didn't freeze. To freeze was to die. Instead, he smoothly pivoted, offering the tray of champagne to a woman in a backless emerald gown standing just inches from Croft. Tap-buzz-tap. The band was syncing. It was searching for the handshake protocol of the Genesis watch. Elias held his breath, his face a mask of serene servitude, while beneath his cuff, a silent, invisible war of cryptography waged in the span of a millimeter. He bowed his head, letting the roar of the gala wash over him, as the digital locks of the most powerful man in the world began to silently click open. The silver tray was a deceptive masterclass in physics, demanding a perfect equilibrium of wrist, forearm, and spine. Elias Vance balanced the polished platter with the casual grace of a man who had spent thousands of hours rendering himself entirely unremarkable. Upon the mirror-bright surface sat a dozen fluted glasses of Dom Perignon, their rising ribbons of bubbles catching the fractured light of the ballroom's three-tiered crystal chandeliers. Julian Croft's penthouse was less a residence and more a monument to untouchable capital. Perched 80 floors above the neon-bleared arteries of the city, the grand ballroom was a sweeping expanse of Calacatta marble, vaulted ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling smart glass that currently displayed the sprawling, glittering metropolis below. The air was thick with the intoxicating, expensive scents of ambergris, saffron and white truffles, layered over the sharp ozone tang of high-end electrostatic climate control. Elias moved through the sea of bespoke tuxedos and haute couture gowns. He was a ghost in a starched white shirt and a black vest, an entity defined only by the service he provided. To the titans of industry, hedge fund managers, and vapid socialites populating the room, Elias did not have a face. He did not have a name. He was simply a mechanism by which champagne was delivered and empty glasses were vanished. He relied on that blindness. In fact, he was currently weaponizing it. Beneath the immaculately tailored cuff of his left sleeve, secured tightly against his radial artery, a heavily modified haptic transceiver pulsed with the rhythmic, erratic heartbeat of encrypted data. The device was no larger than a postage stamp, built from stripped-down military-grade silicon, and it was currently reaching out, feeling for the invisible localized frequencies of Croft's outer security grid. Asterisk top. Top top. Pause. Tap. Asterisk. The vibrations against Elias's skin translated the digital handshake. He was approaching the primary firewall threshold. Julian Croft was a man who understood the value of paranoia. His personal servers weren't connected to the global net. They were entirely localized, air-gapped from the outside world, and protected by a mesh network of proximity sensors disguised as architectural features. To hack Croft, you couldn't be sitting in a dark basement halfway across the world. You had to be in the room. You had to be breathing his air. Elias navigated a tight cluster of venture capitalists arguing over lithium futures. He offered a slight, deferential bow as a woman dripping in Van Cleef diamonds blindly reached out, her manicured fingers plucking a flute from his tray without so much as a glance in his direction. "Thank you for your contribution to the cause," Elias thought wryly, stepping past her. He adjusted his trajectory, drifting toward the northern quadrant of the ballroom. There, beneath a towering abstract sculpture of twisted bronze, stood Julian Croft. Croft possessed the effortless, predatory magnetism of a man who had never been told no. He was in his late 40s, with silvering hair perfectly styled, wearing a midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than Elias's childhood home. He was holding court, an amused shark-like smile playing on his lips as he listened to a sweating senator attempt to curry favor. But Elias's eyes were not on the billionaire. They shifted, darting beneath lowered lashes, to the man standing 3 paces behind Croft's right shoulder. Marcus Thorne. If Croft was the architect of the fortress, Thorne was the wolf pacing its battlements. The head of security was a monolith of a man, his broad shoulders straining the seams of his charcoal suit. Unlike the guests, Thorne wasn't drinking. Unlike the guests, Thorne wasn't blinded by the illusion of absolute safety. His dark, deep-set eyes scanned the crowd with algorithmic precision, breaking the room down into vectors, threats, and anomalies. He wore a discreet earpiece, and the faint blue glow of a retinal heads-up display occasionally flickered across his left pupil. Elias felt a cold bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. Thorne was a kinetic and digital nightmare. If the haptic transceiver on Elias's wrist broadcasted a signal too loud, Thorne's sweepers would catch the anomaly. The hack had to be a whisper. It had to be a slow, bleeding siphon of data that mimicked the ambient background noise of 100 guests' smartphones. Elias slowed his pace. The proximity meter on his wrist tapped furiously. Tap, 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 tap. He was within 3 meters of the bronze sculpture. Hidden within its base was a secondary router, a bridge to the inner network. Elias needed 30 seconds of uninterrupted proximity to inject the payload. He turned gracefully, presenting the tray of champagne to a trio of laughing socialites lingering near the sculpture. "Champagne, ladies?" he asked, his voice smooth, modulated to the exact deferential pitch of a high-end server. They ignored him, continuing their breathless gossip, but one waved a hand dismissively, taking a glass. Elias remained frozen in place, a polite, vacant smile plastered on his face. 10 seconds. His wrist vibrated as the transceiver synced with the router's frequency. It was running a brute force dictionary attack on the node's localized password, utilizing a vulnerability Elias had spent 3 months coding. Thorne's head snapped up. The security chief's gaze cut through the crowd, locking onto the cluster of guests near the bronze sculpture. Elias felt the physical weight of that stare. It was like being targeted by a sniper's laser. Thorne's eyes drifted from the socialites, landing squarely on Elias. Every instinct honed from years in the digital underground screamed at Elias to move, to break eye contact, to vanish into the kitchen. But movement was an anomaly. Fear was an anomaly. Elias held his ground. He didn't look at Thorne. Instead, he kept his gaze slightly downcast, adopting the bored, invisible posture of a man waiting for a rich woman to finish her story so he could collect her empty napkin. He let his shoulders slouch a fraction. He made himself small. He made himself the help. Thorne stared for a long, agonizing moment. The blue light of his retinal display flared briefly. He was running a facial recognition sweep. Elias held his breath. His identity in Croft's system was pristine. A fabricated ghost named Arthur Penhaligon, complete with a 6-year work history at elite catering firms, falsified tax records, and a meticulously boring digital footprint. If the disguise held, he was nothing. 20 seconds. The haptic motor buzzed a steady, low hum. The firewall was fracturing. Thorne's eyes lingered for another second, then dismissed him entirely. The security chief turned his attention back to the sweeping panoramic windows, scanning for external threats, entirely oblivious to the parasite standing 3 feet away. A long, slow exhale escaped Elias's lips. The tension in his forearms was searing, the silver tray suddenly feeling as though it weighed 100 pounds. 30 seconds. A sharp double pulse vibrated against his wrist. Access granted. The outer firewall had collapsed. Elias's custom malware was now successfully embedded in the bronze sculpture's node, silently opening a backdoor into Julian Croft's private server. The payload was a sleeper, designed to remain dormant until Elias triggered it for the central extraction. The first lock was picked. Elias smoothly pivoted on his heel, seamlessly blending back into the perpetual orbit of the catering staff. He approached a side table, expertly swapping his half-empty tray for a fresh one loaded with caviar blinis. He risked a fleeting glance back toward the center of the room. Julian Croft was laughing, raising his glass in a toast to the sweating senator, completely unaware that the invisible walls of his empire had just been breached by the man pouring his drinks. Elias adjusted the fresh tray on his fingertips, his face a mask of placid servitude. The hors d'oeuvres were served, the firewalls were bypassed, and the night was only just beginning. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel had been transformed into a temple of modern vanity, its soul entirely ripped out and replaced by cold, pulsing silicon. Elias Vance stood near the edge of the room, a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon resting lightly in his palm. He did not drink. He merely let the rising bubbles mimic the illusion of his participation. Beneath his polished Oxford shoes lay the centerpiece of the evening, a sprawling reinforced glass stage that doubled as a transparent floor. Beneath the 2-inch thick pane of engineered quartz, bathed in an ethereal liquid nitrogen blue light, was the Omnicore. It was a staggering piece of server architecture, a labyrinth of fiber optic veins, gold-plated processors, and humongous liquid cooling tubes that looked less like hardware and more like the beating heart of some sleeping leviathan. It was the physical manifestation of Julian Croft's new decentralized financial platform, and tonight Elias was going to kill it. The air in the ballroom was thick with the suffocating scent of Tom Ford cologne, bergamot, and the metallic tang of ozone bleeding up through the floor vents. The global elite, hedge fund managers, tech barons, and compromised politicians, mingled in their bespoke tuxedos and haute couture gowns, oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on top of the vault that held their darkest secrets. Elias adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue Brioni jacket, his fingers brushing against the rigid, matte black casing of the bypass drive strapped to his left forearm. He needed to reach the central maintenance node. The problem was the perimeter. Through the head of security moved like a wolf among sheep. Thorne was a mountain of a man, squeezed into a severe charcoal suit that did nothing to hide the lethal, coiled spring tension of his musculature. While the guests schmoozed, Thorne's pale, lifeless eyes scanned hands, waistlines, and sightlines. He operated on a strict 6-minute rotational sweep. Elias had spent the first 2 chapters of the evening mapping the man's rhythm. Thorne was currently at the north exit, berating a junior guard through a discreet earpiece. That gave Elias precisely 4 minutes before Thorne's gaze swept the southern pillar where the primary structural maintenance hatch was concealed. Suddenly, the ambient hum of a string quartet was swallowed by a sharp, synthetic bass drop that vibrated through the soles of Elias's shoes. A single blinding spotlight cleaved through the darkness, striking the center of the glass stage. The murmurs of the elite died instantly. Julian Croft stepped into the light. He did not wear a tuxedo. In a room full of billionaires adhering to a strict black tie dress code, Croft wore a cashmere turtleneck, dark tailored denim, and pristine white sneakers. It was the ultimate power move. A sartorial middle finger that screamed he was above their rules. Croft possessed the kind of manufactured charisma that only unimaginable wealth could buy. His jawline was sharp, his teeth a terrifyingly perfect white, and his eyes burned with the manic fervor of a man who firmly believed he was the architect of the next human epoch. It was smooth, rich, and dripping with condescension. Welcome to the obsolescence of the old world. A ripple of polite, eager laughter washed through the crowd. He set his champagne flute down on a passing waiter's silver tray and took 3 measured steps backward, slipping into the heavy shadow cast by the southern marble pillar. For 5,000 years humanity has locked its valuables in vaults of steel and stone, Croft continued, pacing the glass floor. Beneath him the azure lights of the Omnicore pulsed in time with his footsteps, responding to the pressure of his stride. But steel rusts, stone crumbles, and men are corruptible. Elias knelt. To anyone glancing his way, it would appear he was merely retying a shoelace. In reality, his fingers were flying over the baseboard of the pillar. He located the microscopic seam in the marble veneer. The biometric spoofing film grafted to his thumbprint, harvested off a discarded highball glass used by one of Croft's lead engineers 3 days prior, flashed green. A small 6-inch panel popped open with a soft hiss. What you are standing on tonight is not merely a server, Croft's voice rose, vibrating with evangelistic zeal. He threw his arms wide, looking up at the chandelier as if addressing the heavens. Omnicore is a fortress built of mathematics. It is a closed-loop, quantum-encrypted sanctuary. The media calls it a bank. I call it an impenetrable digital nation-state. No government can subpoena it. No rival can outcompute it. And no hacker, no matter how brilliant they believe they are, can ever breach it. Bold words, Elias thought, his face a mask of absolute calm. From his sleeve he slid the bypass drive. A slender titanium spike laced with a proprietary worm designed to exploit a 0-day vulnerability in the liquid cooling subsystem's logic controller. He just needed to plug it into the service port and twist. They said privacy was dead, Croft shouted, his voice reaching a crescendo. The ambient music swelled beneath his words, a triumphant cinematic score designed to manipulate the heart rates of the investors in the room. I say privacy is reborn. Tonight we do not just launch a platform. Tonight we lock the gates of the Citadel and throw away the key. Marcus Thorne was moving. Out of the corner of his eye, Elias saw the security chief pivot from the north exit, his hawkish gaze cutting through the crowd. 3 minutes had passed. Thorne was ahead of schedule. Something had spooked him. The security chief's hand rested lightly against the lapel of his jacket, his eyes scanning the shadows near the pillars. He was 50 feet away, then 40. To Omnicore, Croft roared, snatching a glass of champagne from a terrified attendant. To the indestructible future. The applause was instantaneous and deafening. It erupted from the crowd like a thunderclap, a roaring wave of manicured hands clapping cheers, and the sharp whistling of hedge fund managers drunk on the promise of untraceable wealth. It was the perfect acoustic cover. Under the thunderous roar of the billionaire's toast, Elias jammed the titanium spike into the data port. He felt the mechanical click of the connection. He twisted it precisely 90 degrees to the right. The bypass drive lit up, a single microscopic red LED pulsing in the darkness of the open hatch. Elias's customized malicious code. A digital ghost specifically engineered to bypass the quantum firewall by hitching a ride on the thermal regulation data packets, flooded into the indestructible Omnicore. Elias smoothly pushed the marble panel back into place, the magnetic locks engaging with a faint snap just as the applause began to wane. He stood up, elegantly shooting his cuffs, and stepped out from the shadow of the pillar. He was a split second too late. Marcus Thorne broke through the edge of the crowd, stopping dead just 10 feet from Elias. The security chief's eyes dropped to the floor, tracing the exact spot where Elias had been kneeling, before snapping up to meet Elias's gaze. The air between them seemed to freeze, the temperature plummeting despite the stifling heat of the crowded room. Thorne's hand slipped inside his jacket, reaching for his shoulder holster. Up on the glass stage, Julian Croft smiled, raising his glass higher, completely unaware that directly beneath his pristine white sneakers, the azure lights of his indestructible empire had just flickered, for a fraction of a second, to a deep blood red. The applause following Julian Croft's toast lingered in the grand ballroom like the dissipating smoke of a fired gun. It was a wealthy sound, polite but heavy, echoing off the gold-leafed vaulted ceilings and sinking into the thick sound-dampening weave of the Persian carpets. Elias Vance stood with his back rigidly straight, a polished silver tray balanced expertly on the spread fingertips of his left hand. To the untrained eye, he was merely part of the architecture, a faceless purveyor of Dom Perignon and Beluga caviar, clad in the same immaculate, stiff-collared black and white uniform as the 40 other servers weaving through the sea of sequined evening gowns and bespoke tuxedos. But Elias was not moving like the others. There is a distinct, almost mathematical geometry to high-end hospitality. Waiters move in elliptical orbits, tethered to the kitchens and the service bars, sweeping the room in predictable, sweeping arcs to ensure no guest is ever left wanting. Yet no servant ever lingers long enough to become a person. Elias, however, was tracing an entirely different shape. He was moving in a tightened, deliberate spiral, drifting inexorably toward the East Wing corridor. Beyond the velvet ropes and the burly, earpiece-wearing security detail standing guard, lay the physical nexus of Croft's internal network. The polymorphic malware Elias had successfully injected via the hors d'oeuvres tray during the cocktail hour was propagating perfectly through the superficial systems. But to finalize the handshake and rip the encrypted offshore ledgers, he needed to bridge the air gap. He needed to be within 30 feet of the server room door. He was currently at 50 feet. Elias stepped smoothly around a cluster of laughing socialites, his eyes fixed dead ahead while his peripheral vision processed the shifting dynamics of the room in a hypervigilant blur. He sidestepped a gesturing tech mogul, the crystal flutes on his tray shivering but not daring to clink. 45 feet. The digital progress bar in his retina display contact lens crawled agonizingly from 68 to 70%. Then, the fine hairs on the back of Elias's neck stood at attention. It was a primal instinct, a cold prickle of warning honed over a dozen high-stakes infiltrations in places far less forgiving than a Silicon Valley billionaire's gala. He didn't turn his head. He didn't break his stride. Instead, he angled his silver tray downward just a fraction of an inch, using the highly polished surface as a convex mirror to view the room behind him. Marcus Thorne was watching him. The chief of security stood on the landing of the mezzanine's sweeping marble staircase, completely still amidst the flowing, glittering current of guests. Where the billionaires and politicians exuded an aura of relaxed, careless entitlement, Thorne radiated kinetic, coiled tension. He was a man built of granite and paranoia, his tailored tuxedo struggling to contain the sheer, brutal bulk of his shoulders. His eyes, pale, flat, and unblinking, were locked directly onto Elias's trajectory. Thorne was no fool. He didn't know Elias's face. The digital ghosting Elias had performed on the catering staff's biometric registry earlier that afternoon was flawless, but Thorne knew patterns. He knew the rhythm of a secure room. He knew that a waiter carrying a tray in the warped reflection of the tray, Elias watched Thorne bring a thick finger to his earpiece, mutter something into his cuff, and begin a slow, deliberate descent down the marble stairs. Damn it, Elias thought, his heart rate spiking an imperceptible few beats per minute against his ribs. He couldn't bolt. Running meant failure, immediate capture, and disappearing into one of Croft's black site corporate prisons before the sun came up. He had to play the role. He had to be nothing more than the uniform. Elias immediately altered his trajectory, breaking the suspicious spiral. He pivoted gracefully on his heel, intercepting an elderly woman dripping in heirloom diamonds, offering her a glass with a deep, deferential bow. She took it without so much as glancing at his face. Elias moved again, weaving back toward the dense center of the room, desperately trying to lose himself in the shifting herd of elite humanity. But Thorne was a bloodhound who had caught a fresh scent. The security chief cut through the crowd with quiet, ruthless efficiency. Guests subconsciously parted for him, their primitive brains sensing the violence vibrating just beneath his polished veneer. 40 feet. Elias needed to get back to the east wing, but Thorne was rapidly closing the distance. 30 feet. 20. You there. The voice was low, gravelly, and pitched precisely to cut through the ambient jazz and chatter without raising a general alarm. Elias froze, perfectly executing the startled, slightly terrified posture of a subordinate who had just been caught dropping a fork. He turned slowly, lowering his eyes to Thorne's lapel, avoiding direct eye contact in the universal, instinctual posture of the subservient. Yes, sir? Elias asked, his voice pitching up half an octave, laced with engineered timidity. Thorne stepped uncomfortably close, invading Elias's personal space. The man smelled of heavy starch, expensive gun oil and peppermint. What's your section, son? Section 4, sir. The South Terrace and the perimeter tables. The perimeter, Thorne repeated slowly, his pale eyes scanning the angles of Elias's face, looking for the telltale micro-expressions of a liar. And yet, I've been watching you drift toward the east corridor for the last 3 minutes. There are no guests over there. Only my men. Are you lost? No, sir. I apologize, sir. I thought I saw a guest leave a soiled glass on the decorative plinth near the ice sculptures. I was moving to clear it. Thorne's heavy gaze dropped to Elias's tray. Your tray is full of fresh glasses. You don't clear with a full tray. Elias's mind raced, searching for an out. Thorne was good. Too good. The digital upload in his eye blinked a warning. 74%. Signal strength dropping. Move closer to target. I'm sorry, sir. It's my first night working a private party of this scale. I'm just trying to be thorough. Elias stammered, letting a slight, nervous tremor enter his hand so the crystal flutes rattled ever so slightly against the silver base. Thorne leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. Look at me. Elias slowly raised his eyes, projecting wide, innocent fear. Thorne's gaze was like a physical weight, probing, searching for the wolf beneath the sheep's clothing. Thorne's right hand twitched toward his inner jacket pocket, likely reaching for the biometric scanner that would reveal Elias's falsified credentials as a hollow digital shell. If Thorne scanned his badge, the game was over. Elias desperately needed a distraction. He scanned the immediate vicinity through the corners of his eyes, his mind calculating variables at lightning speed. And then he saw his shield. Julian Croft. The billionaire host was standing less than 10 feet away, holding court with a circle of stiff-backed foreign investors. Croft was mid-sentence, his face flushed with the arrogance of the newly toasted, but his hand was gesturing wildly in the air, holding an empty highball glass. Croft was not looking at his guests. He was glaring over their shoulders, his mouth tightening into a furious, entitled sneer as he searched the room for a servant to remedy his empty hand. It was a window of less than a second. Before Thorne could withdraw the scanner from his coat, Elias stepped smoothly around the massive security chief. It was a brazen move, incredibly rude for a mere waiter, but Elias executed it with the absolute, unquestioning authority of a servant answering his master's unspoken call. Excuse me, sir, Elias murmured to Thorne, brushing past him. Thorne stiffened, his hand shooting out to grab Elias's shoulder. Hey! But Elias was already stepping into the invisible, terrifying circle of Julian Croft's personal space. With the fluid grace of a ballet dancer, Elias materialized at Croft's elbow exactly as the billionaire opened his mouth to shout for service. You're McAllen, Mr. Croft, Elias said softly, his voice perfectly modulated to be heard but not intrusive. He tilted the silver tray, presenting a fresh, heavy crystal glass of the amber liquid that he had specifically requisitioned from the bar 10 minutes prior, knowing Croft's preferred, impossibly rare poison. Neat as requested. Croft blinked, momentarily startled by the sudden, ghostly appearance of the waiter. The billionaire's rising anger evaporated in an instant, replaced by the smug, comfortable satisfaction of a man whose every whim is anticipated and catered to by a frictionless universe. "Ah," Croft said, taking the glass without a single word of thanks. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and smiled. "Excellent. Finally, someone competent in this room." Thorne stepped up to the edge of the circle, his face a dark thundercloud. "Mr. Croft, I need to speak with this man." Croft turned, his smile vanishing as he looked at his chief of security. The billionaire despised having his reality interrupted by logistics. "Marcus? What is it?" "We are in the middle of a rather delicate conversation regarding the Tokyo expansion." "It's a security protocol, sir," Thorne said, his pale eyes drilling holes into the back of Elias's skull. "I need to verify his credentials. His movement pattern is—" "Are you joking?" Croft snapped, his voice ringing out sharply, silencing the nearby investors. "You want to interrogate the only waiter in this godforsaken room, who actually knows how to keep my glass full? Look around, Marcus. Half my guests are parched while you chase ghosts and play spy." "Sir, his patrol route was irregular. I just need to scan." "You need to do your job and secure the perimeter, not harass the catering staff," Croft interrupted, stepping into Thorne's space, effortlessly using his immense wealth as a bludgeon against the larger man's physical intimidation. "Leave the boy alone. In fact, you," Croft pointed a manicured, heavy-ringed finger at Elias, "you are on my personal detail for the rest of the night. Do not leave my sight." Elias bowed his head deeply, hiding the icy, victorious smile that touched the corners of his lips. "As you wish, Mr. Croft. It would be an honor." Thorne's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked visibly beneath his ear. He looked from Croft to Elias, the suspicion in his pale eyes burning hotter and brighter than ever. He knew something was wrong, his instincts screaming at him. But in the rigid hierarchy of this gilded world, the billionaire's word was absolute law. "Understood, sir," Thorne ground out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He took a reluctant step back, but locked eyes with Elias one last time. The silent message was abundantly clear. "I am watching you. If you slip, I will break you. Enjoy your evening." Thorne turned and stalked away, his massive frame disappearing into the glittering, oblivious crowd. Elias exhaled, a slow, meticulously controlled breath out of his nose. The adrenaline was a cold, electric acid in his veins, but his hands remained perfectly steady beneath the silver tray. He stepped back, melting into the shadows just behind Croft's right shoulder, becoming the perfect, invisible servant once more. He was safe for now, and better yet, he was exactly where he needed to be. Croft, eager to pivot away from the awkward interruption, had just gestured for his investors to follow him, dragging Elias directly toward the east wing to show off his private, heavily guarded art collection. Elias glanced at the velvet ropes as they approached the corridor. 25 feet. 20 feet. In the corner of his vision, the digital readout in his lens pulsed a brilliant, violent green. Handshake accepted. Download commencing. Elias adjusted his grip on the silver tray, lifted his chin, and followed the billionaire into the lion's den. The crosshairs of Marcus Thorne's gaze felt like a physical weight pressing into the space between Elias's shoulder blades. It was a cold, crawling sensation, the primal instinct of prey registering the unblinking stare of a predator. Elias didn't need to turn around to know the security chief was tracking him through the dense, perfumed forest of the gala. He could feel it in the subtle parting of the crowd, the slight shift in the room's ambient acoustics as Thorne's broad, tailored shoulders carved a path through the elite of Manhattan. Elias adjusted his grip on the silver serving tray, his white-gloved fingers resting lightly against the stems of 3 crystal flutes filled with vintage Dom Perignon. Beneath the starched white cocktail napkin in the center of the tray lay the payload, a custom-milled biometric flash drive no larger than a stick of chewing gum. It contained a sleek, vicious piece of malware designed to dismantle Julian Croft's financial empire from the inside out. But a digital skeleton key was useless without a lock, and the lock was currently surrounded by a moat of billionaires. Through the vaulted glass doors of the grand ballroom, Elias could see his target. Julian Croft's private master terminal was an audacious monument to the tech mogul's ego. Situated on a raised dais in the adjacent VIP study, the terminal was an obsidian monolith, a bleeding-edge quantum server completely air-gapped from the outside world. It was surrounded by a semicircular leather banquette where Croft was currently holding court. Elias's earpiece, disguised as a standard-issue catering comm, clicked twice in his right ear. It was the automated proximity warning. Thorn was closing the distance. 20 yards. 15. Time to move, Elias thought, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He forced his breathing to slow, adopting the invisible subservient posture of high-end waitstaff. He glided toward the glass doors of the study, slipping past a cluster of socialites dripping in Cartier. The string quartet in the corner launched into a frenetic movement of Vivaldi's Winter, the sharp, aggressive bowing of the violins perfectly matching the spike of adrenaline in Elias's veins. He stepped into the VIP study. The air here was cooler, smelling sharply of ozone from the server racks, expensive cigar smoke, and the rich, leathery scent of power. Julian Croft stood near the terminal, a snifter of cognac in hand, his sharp, predatory features illuminated by the icy blue glow of the server's LED displays. Beside him was Arthur Pendleton, a florid-faced venture capitalist who was 3 drinks past his limit and pontificating loudly about offshore server farms. Pendleton was known for 2 things: his aggressive portfolio and his wildly erratic sweeping hand gestures when intoxicated. He was the perfect mark. Elias mapped the room in a fraction of a second. Croft to the left, Pendleton dead center, standing a mere 2 feet from the master terminal's concealed physical access port. Thorn stepping through the glass doors behind Elias, his dark eyes locking onto the back of Elias's neck, a hand rising to the earpiece hidden in his dark hair. The window of opportunity wasn't just closing, it was slamming shut. Elias stepped forward, his eyes locked on the floor, playing the dutiful servant. He angled his approach so that he entered Pendleton's blind spot, directly between the wealthy loudmouth and the obsidian terminal. He watched Pendleton's shoulders, the kinetic buildup of the man's physical energy. "I told them, Julian, you can't regulate what you can't catch," Pendleton bellowed, his voice booming over the low hum of the servers. "Wait for it," Elias told himself, stepping into the strike zone. *3, 2, 1. Pendleton threw his right arm out in a massive, theatrical sweep just as Elias stepped into the precise arc of his hand. The collision was magnificent in its violence. Pendleton's heavy gold Rolex caught the edge of the silver tray. Physics took over. Elias didn't resist the impact. He leaned into it, allowing the tray to violently tip upward. The 3 crystal flutes launched into the air in a glittering, chaotic parabola. Time seemed to dilate. Elias watched the amber liquid suspended in the air, catching the light of the bespoke chandeliers like liquid gold. Then the silence of the moment shattered. The glasses crashed against the edge of the obsidian terminal and exploded over Pendleton's immaculate Tom Ford tuxedo. Shards of baccarat crystal rained down on the polished marble floor with a deafening clatter. Champagne splashed across the sleek, dark housing of Croft's prize server, dripping down the matte finish. "What in God's name?" Pendleton shrieked, jumping back as the icy champagne soaked through his shirt. "Watch it, you clumsy idiot," Croft barked, his aristocratic composure cracking instantly. He lunged forward to inspect his precious machine, swatting blindly at the air. Chaos erupted in the VIP study. Guests gasped, security personnel barked into their cuffs, and the ambient noise level spiked into a cacophony of outrage. Elias was already in motion. The moment the tray flipped, he had palmed the microdrive hidden beneath the napkin. As the glasses shattered, he dropped to his knees, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "I am so sorry, sir. I am so sorry," Elias babbled, his voice trembling perfectly. He pulled a thick white bar towel from his apron and began frantically wiping at the floor, crawling directly into the space between Pendleton's legs and the base of the terminal. "Get him away from me," Pendleton sputtered, brushing at his lapels. "Check the terminal. Wipe the moisture off the casing," Croft yelled, gesturing wildly. Under the cover of the screaming billionaires and his own sweeping towel, Elias's left hand shot out. His fingers found the recessed groove near the bottom of the server rack. He pressed the hidden latch. A small secondary panel popped open, revealing the diagnostic USB port. He jammed the custom microdrive into the slot. A microscopic red LED on the drive blinked to life. Asterisk solid red. Flashing amber. Asterisk the payload was unpacking. It was an automated script, designed to tunnel past the firewall, mirror the encrypted ledgers, and inject a dormant Trojan horse into the mainframe. It would take precisely 8 seconds. What happened here? The deep, gravelly voice of Marcus Thorne cut through the chaos like a serrated blade. Elias didn't look up. He kept scrubbing the marble floor, his heart thrashing against his ribcage like a trapped bird. 3 seconds. This imbecile practically threw a tray of drinks at Arthur. Croft sneered. And right on the Genesis console. Thorne, get him out of my sight before I have him thrown off the balcony. 5 seconds. The LED on the drive flashed green, a furious rapid pulse. Heavy footsteps approached. Thorne's highly polished Oxfords appeared in Elias's peripheral vision, stepping into the puddle of spilled champagne, uncaring of the mess. Stand up, Thorne commanded. The voice wasn't a request, it was a physical force. 7 seconds. Elias kept his head bowed, his hands shaking. An easy enough reaction to fake given the adrenaline flooding his system. I just need to clean the... I said stand up. Thorne repeated, and a massive calloused hand clamped onto Elias's shoulder, gripping the fabric of his white uniform with bruising force. 8 seconds. The LED went dark. The upload was complete. In a single fluid motion masked by his terrified flinching, Elias's left hand darted to the port, pinched the microdrive and pulled it free. He curled it into his palm, instantly transferring it to the folds of the damp bar towel as Thorne hauled him roughly to his feet. Elias let his jaw slacken, widening his eyes as he looked up into Thorne's terrifyingly calm face. The security chief's eyes were cold, calculating, scanning Elias's face for any micro-expression that didn't belong to a terrified waiter. I tripped, Elias stammered, his voice cracking. The gentleman moved and I lost my footing. Please, I need this job. Thorne didn't blink. He looked past Elias, his gaze sweeping over the terminal. He noted the wet streaks of champagne on the obsidian casing, the shattered glass, the perfectly mundane chaos of an accident. Slowly, his eyes drifted back to Elias. The grip on Elias's shoulder tightened, the thumb pressing painfully into his collarbone. Thorne knew something was wrong. His instincts were screaming it. But there was no proof, only a pathetic, trembling caterer clutching a wet towel. Thorne! Croft snapped, dabbing at a droplet of champagne on his own cuff. Are you deaf? Remove him. Now. Thorne held Elias's gaze for one agonizing second longer. Then, the grip shifted from Elias's shoulder to the scruff of his collar. Walk, Thorne growled, shoving Elias forward. Elias stumbled, clutching the damp towel to his chest. As he was marched out of the VIP study, past the glaring eyes of the elite and into the glittering, ignorant expanse of the main ballroom, a bead of cold sweat rolled down the side of his face. His heart rate finally began to slow. Hidden safely within the damp folds of the terrycloth towel, his fingers traced the hard plastic edge of the microdrive. The billionaires were still complaining about their ruined suits, completely unaware that their invisible empire had just been burned to the ground. The spilled champagne was still sinking into the fibers of the Persian rug, a dark, spreading stain that nobody but Elias Vance seemed to notice. He took 3 measured steps backward, allowing the natural ebb and flow of the gala to swallow him. The ballroom of the Croft Spire was a monument to excess, an architectural marvel suspended 80 stories above Manhattan, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered the gods of finance a panoramic view of the mortals below. But the true centerpiece of the room wasn't the skyline. It was the sprawling 80-foot curved OLED display hovering above the grand staircase. For the past 2 hours it had been a sleek, pulsating testament to Julian Croft's digital empire, Aegis Sovereign. It displayed a calming corporate Azure, tracking global data nodes, real-time stock valuations, and the impenetrable firewall status of the world's most powerful cybersecurity firm. Elias pressed his spine against the cool marble of a Corinthian pillar, his silver serving tray tucked casually beneath his left arm. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't need to. the payload he had delivered through the spilled drink, and the cloned NFC tag was already navigating the labyrinth. At exactly 10:42 p.m., the jazz quartet in the corner hit a crescendo, and the 80-foot screen above them blinked. It was a microscopic stutter, a dropped frame in a flawless 4K projection, but to Elias's trained eye, it was the first crack in the dam. A single jagged line of dead pixels tore horizontally across the corporate azure. Down on the floor, Julian Croft was holding court, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand, his teeth gleaming as he laughed at a joke told by a senior senator. Croft looked every inch the tech messiah. Tailored velvet tuxedo, effortless posture, the arrogant ease of a man who believed he held the keys to the modern world. He didn't see the screen. But Marcus Thorne did. Standing by the eastern exit, the head of security stiffened. Even from across the crowded room, Elias could see the subtle shift in Thorne's body language. The broad-shouldered ex-mercenary tapped his earpiece, his brow furrowing as the ambient feed from his command center likely dissolved into a wash of static. Thorne's eyes, cold and predatory, began to sweep the room. He was looking for a physical threat. A man with a gun, a misplaced briefcase, a sudden movement. It was a tragic, almost poetic obsolescence. Thorne was a mastiff guarding a vault, completely unaware that the gold was already being vaporized into the ether. The screen blinked again. This time there was no missing it. The soothing blue of the Aegis logo shattered into a violent, digital mosaic. A low synthetic hum began to bleed through the ballroom's hidden speakers, a frequency glitch that caused the jazz cellist to falter, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. Croft finally turned around, the senator's punchline dying in the sudden heavy silence. The billionaire's smile froze. Across the massive curved display, the azure blue inverted. The room was suddenly bathed in an infernal glaring crimson. The sheer output of the red light cast long, demonic shadows across the faces of the assembled elite, turning the glittering diamonds and platinum watches into drops of blood. Then came the text. Not the elegant, bespoke typography of Aegis Sovereign, but raw, brutalist hexadecimal code raining down the screens at a blinding speed. Critical failure. Root access overridden, purging directories. 0x000. Elias watched, his pulse resting at a steady calm 60 beats per minute. The silent, devastating collapse had begun. The worm wasn't just stealing Croft's data. It was salting the digital earth. Offshore accounts, proprietary algorithms, the blackmail ledgers Croft used to bend politicians to his will, the uncrackable encryption keys he sold to sovereign states, all of it was being chewed into randomized garbage, unrecoverable and meaningless. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom as the stock ticker at the bottom of the screen, a live feed of Aegis's market valuation, froze, shuddered, and then went into a vertical freefall. Billions of dollars of market cap were evaporating with every passing second. Panic, Elias observed, was a fascinating equalizer. The men and women in this room had spent their lives insulating themselves from consequence. Now, consequence was raining down on them in neon red. Cell phones began to erupt. It started as a sporadic buzzing and quickly escalated into a chaotic cacophony of custom ringtones and desperate chimes. The guests clawed at their pockets and evening bags, their faces contorting in horror as their screens flashed with margin calls, locked accounts and automated security alerts from their own compromised institutions. Croft's system was integrated into all of theirs. The Aegis shield hadn't just fallen. It had shattered into shrapnel, taking their portfolios with it. "Marcus!" Croft bellowed, his voice cracking, the scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass and staining his velvet cuff. "Marcus, cut the hard lines. Shut it down." Thorne was already moving, shoving past a panicked venture capitalist, barking frantic orders into a dead earpiece. "Lock down the physical layer. Seal the doors." Thorne roared, reaching the central console embedded in the wall. He slammed his palm against the biometric scanner. The scanner flashed red. Service denied. Elias allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Croft had tied the building's physical security protocols into the Aegis mainframe to boast about its efficiency. With the mainframe burning to the ground, the electronic locks were frozen. The elevators were dead. The titanium blast doors were stuck open. The fortress had become a tomb of their own making. It was time to leave. Elias stepped away from the pillar, moving with the liquid grace of a shadow. He didn't run. Running drew the eye. He simply walked with the chaotic currents of the crowd, matching the frantic pacing of the billionaires as they surged blindly toward the grand staircase, shouting into dead phones. He placed his silver serving tray onto the surface of an abandoned dessert cart. With a fluid, practiced motion, he pulled the breakaway knot of his black bow tie, slipping it into his pocket. He unbuttoned the stiff collar of the waiter's shirt, shedding the subservient posture he had worn for the past 6 hours. His shoulders broadened, his gait lengthened. He ceased to be the help. He ceased to be anyone at all. Through the gaps in the panicking crowd, Elias caught one final glimpse of Julian Croft. The billionaire was on his knees amid the spilled champagne and trampled caviar, his hands gripping his hair, staring up at the blood-red screens as his legacy was reduced to zero. Thorne stood over him, a gun drawn, aiming uselessly at the ceiling, trying to shoot a ghost that lived in the wires. Elias slipped through the heavy, brass-studded doors of the Western Service corridor. The air here was instantly different, stale, smelling of industrial cleaner and ozone, a stark contrast to the cloying perfume and fear of the ballroom. He bypassed the electronic service elevators, knowing they were as dead as the rest of the building, and pushed open the door to the emergency stairwell. He descended the concrete steps with a rhythmic, unhurried cadence. Floor by floor, the muffled screams of the elite faded into silence. By the time he reached the ground floor loading dock, he had stripped off the black vest and rolled up his sleeves, revealing a plain, dark Henley. He pushed open the heavy steel egress door. The freezing November wind hit him instantly, a sharp, bracing slap that tasted of exhaust fumes and impending snow. The cacophony of New York City rushed in to greet him, the wail of distant sirens, the grind of garbage trucks, the relentless, beautiful hum of a world unaware of the kings that had just been dethroned in the clouds above. Elias Vance stepped out of the alley and onto the damp pavement of the avenue. He flipped up the collar of his jacket, shoved his hands into his pockets, and merged with the late-night pedestrian traffic. He didn't look back at the Croft spire. He didn't need to. The invisible man simply kept walking, swallowed by the neon glow of the city, leaving nothing behind but ruins.